Welcome to this evening's Regen Ag Chat. So we've called this evening is Beetlemania. So I'm just about to get Ceri and Darren to introduce themselves and also why they love dung beetles. That's the first thing. And this evening we'll basically be talking about dung beetles a lot. We'll also be talking about what their role is and why they are important and how we can understand what we've got. And also how can we get more? So that's the sort of plan. So it'll be quite practical. And there'll be a common theme this evening, which I shall be reminding people to switch their cameras off. Thank you. So, Ceri and Darren.
Hello, everybody. Well, I'm Ceri Mann, and I've been studying dung beetles probably for around about 7 to 8 years now. So I came to it in my 40s, and I am a complete convert. I've really came into the whole insects side of things quite late as well, after doing an undergraduate at University of Gloucester, which then led to a master's at Harper Adams, and hence my dung beetle interest was kicked off when I bumped into Darren on a Coleopterist Day meeting and was hooked. So why do I love them? Lots of reasons, so many, but I'll just give you a couple. So firstly, they've just got the most amazing, fascinating life cycles and interactions, which you'll hear about, I'm sure. And also because they've got so many environmental and agro-environmental benefits. And I love the way that they sort of present themselves in a little parcel that you have to open up. It's a bit like getting a Christmas present or something. You know, you have to unwrap it to find out what's inside. And that's just a joy in the field for me, looking at something, trying to guess what's inside, like you would a birthday present or a Christmas present.
Thank you.
I was just born this way.
Didn't realise Lady Gaga was on the call.
Yeah, I've been interested in insects since I was a kid and got kind of very interested. Some would say obsessed with dung beetles by the time I was in my early teens. And it's kind of just continued. And I don't, it's one of those things. I remember when I was at an interview for a job and they said, well, you're obviously interested in insects and very enthusiastic. Do you think, that's going to last? And I'm 23 years in that job now, and I'm still enthusiastic and love insects. So, I mean, it'll continue to the day I die. But dung beetles have become I wouldn't say obsession, I would say my focus. But I now look at dung beetles across the globe. So I don't just do dung beetles in the UK, although I run the National Recording Scheme with Ceri. I travel abroad and do research in dung beetle ecosystem functioning and that sort of thing. So I do get to go to the tropics and look at dung beetles occasionally as well.
Interesting, thank you. Same question to Bruce.
Okay, so my interest in dung beetles, I suppose, started about 10 years ago when I was on a safari in South Africa with my then girlfriend, now wife, and we saw those big dung beetles that we see on National Geographic rolling the dung balls along, and I just thought to myself, gosh, wouldn't there be a great little creature to have on our farm? What contribution did it have to the soil? And I suppose didn't think any much more about it. Didn't realise at the time that we actually had different types of dung beetles on our farm. And 8 years ago, decided that we were constantly increasing our dosing on our young stock in particular. Even the older cows had to get more doses on the farm for parasite worms, and we just at that stage thought we were going to change that, make a change on it. So we thought at the time it was the mectins, ivermectins were reducing the animal's ability to create their own resistance to the parasite. So yeah, that was kind of where the wheels started turning at that stage. Didn't use the mectin since then. And I suppose 4 years ago, I was talking to an entomologist and about these dung beetles, and the entomologist told me like that we actually have dung beetles on my farm, and that that the reason that I was at that stage able to use a lot less animintics was because the dung beetles were killing the parasites in the dung pads and removing the dung pads from pasture. So I got kicking pats, and lo and behold, there were dung beetles in them. So yeah, Liz, that obsession is hasn't wore off. So I'm afraid to tell you it doesn't wear off. So
and importantly, you're now traveling the world as well, looking at hopefully.
Yeah. So I didn't realise that the dung beetles were there all along, underthird.
Number 2.
Number 2, yeah.
Not myself.
Yeah, so it got me onto thinking about what I could do to increase the dung beetle population on the farm, and I created a lot of interest with it, and applied for a Nuffield topic to research it further. And I was very fortunate to be chosen for a scholarship. So that has allowed me to investigate it a lot further. So a big pat on the back to Nuffield there for number 3.
Yeah.
So Bruce, can you just tell us a little bit about your farm?
Okay, yeah. So it's a grass-based conventional dairy farm. And it's spring calving, and we try to convert as much grass to milk solids as possible. That's what the emphasis is on. I suppose that when I came home to farm, there was 54 cows on the farm, and with the abolition of milk quotas in 2015, we're up to 230 this year. So we're quite well stocked on the farm. It'll be reasonably intensive in terms of a grass-based system. We're hoping to milk 250 next year. The cow type is a kind of Jersey Friesian cross, and there's 3 groups of animals on the farm. So we have our cows, our in-calf heifers, our maiden heifers, and our calves. So the sward on the farm is your perennial ryegrass, and in the last couple of years, I've started incorporating chicory into the swards. So that's basically what we're at on the farm. That's where we're at. Yeah. So I'm working. Yeah, my dad is there working with me, and we have a farm manager as well.
So you kind of, as far as dairy farming over in Ireland goes, you're kind of going for it, really, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, there has been a lot of expansion in Ireland in the last few years, because we were kind of we were kind of throttled or constipated, number 4, with the milk quotas. So the brakes were released on us there in 2015. So there's been people like ourselves that had the physical opportunity to expand and milk more cows, but we didn't have the legal opportunity to do it. So I suppose we put down the accelerator pedal and went for it. So that's where we're at.
Okay.
And just in terms of, because I'm just interested in Ceri and Darren's thoughts, because when we were having a conversation a week or so ago, in terms of, we were sort of thinking about what is the ideal farm for dung beetles, and an intensive dairy farm wouldn't be where you would tick the box first, would you? Can you just sort of explain what you're looking for in terms of the types of dung and how long it's on the pasture for, in terms of trying to find the optimum number of dung beetles?
Okay. So the more intensive you go with any sort of grassland habitat and cattle, for example, is the sloppier the dung gets. I think Bruce would agree with that. You've basically got a bit of diarrhea going on with the cattle because of the high nitrates. And the problem with that is a lot of the dung beetles are actually adapted to a more solid dung. So if you've seen, say, Highland or British whites grazing rough pasture, the dung is a very sort of solid and sort of rounded sort of shape pile, as opposed to a sort of like a splat. And so rough pasture, well-drained soils, and permanence and continuity of grazing is where you get the highest diversity of dung beetles. Now that can go sort of and with a range of habitats, so with some hedgerow, some pasture woodland, or something like that. So if you're trying to maximise the effect, it's basically permanent pasture, continual grazing, number of animals, and quality dung. So it's not just about the quantity of dung, it's about the quality and also the availability. So if you're only grazing in a particular month on that area, then the dung beetles that come out later or earlier than the period you're grazing won't have anywhere to go or breed, unless there's dung in the next field or the next few fields. So yeah.
So it's this idea of that there's got to be dung all the way through the year. So I'm guessing deer, or do you mean there'll be something that's out in the winter that will be sort of maintaining the population, but the best is this sort of almost
so from early spring, so you're seeing dung beetles starting to get active depending on the temperature as early as sort of January, February. And they're the sort of shredding ones. They're the ones that actually almost decimate the dung. But they don't actually feed in the dung as larvae. They're actually soil dwellers as larvae. So it's only the adults that eat the dung. So the adults are breaking a lot of the dung down. And one of the reasons we still believe that they're quite widespread and abundant is that they're tolerant of a certain level of pesticide contamination. So there are species level sensitivities, but also the fact that they're quite happy to disperse long distances. So, you know, they can travel, you know, 1 kilometre, 2 kilometre, 10 kilometre between suitable areas, and they're not that specific on the quality of the grassland. So you will find them on, you know, a very runny dung after it's dried out a little bit, but you wouldn't find some of the rarer species on that runny dung, even if it does dry out for a bit.
And so, Bruce, sorry, Nick, just to say, but in terms of, but we were also saying about you are managing your young stock slightly differently, aren't you, to adjust the consistency to try and make it more of a nicer place to live, if that's the words I should be using.
Yeah, we are. Yeah. So, with the young stock, it's much easier to graze animals on that type of grass, but you know, the longer rotation grass, which are your traditional meadow fescues and timities type grasses. So it's possible to do with them. However, with cows, when you're looking to maximize milk production, that kind of grass, you're really looking at a huge reduction in milk output. So it's a matter of striking a balance really with the two. I agree. You do find less dung beetles in those sloppier pads. I did see the opposite of it in Tasmania. I think I sent you a video of it, Liz. Quite sloppy dung pads, and the way they're being attacked by dung beetles over there. They're different species, of course. Well, they are and they aren't. The actual beetles that they've brought into Tasmania are from Europe, quite a lot of them. So they are actually taking into the dung paths. That's the guy there. That's Graham Stevenson. So that's your typical grazing soft green grass. You can see the green grass in the background. High oil content in the grass, which leads to a high kind of it's a very soft type of dung path. So that's kind of what we're looking at in our cows that are milking. High protein. But there would be in Ireland definitely less beetles in those paths. They're there all right. They don't come into them. They seem to take into them later as well. They will take them. You could really be looking at them maybe a fortnight later before the beetles really take into them. Whereas you can kind of see there now. There's that big beetle is what they call the blue bomber. It's Geotroops spinager, and he's in the UK. That beetle is. And he's very prolific in Tasmania. They have there's 4 species I think in that dung pat. That dung pat was 24 hours old. The cows that come off that paddock the night before, and the dung pats. Those dung pats you can actually see it started to dry out with the number of beetles that are in it. Because what what they actually do is actually drink the juices out of the dung pat, and they also bury them into the soil. I was on a paddock that was 3 days post grazing there, and there is a dung pat, or what's left of it. There's absolutely nothing to see of the dung pat. There was no dung pats left, only evidence of them after 3 days. So yeah, it is a good point with the beetles, but they're able to like with sloppy dung pats, but they're able to with a bit of human intervention, in terms of bringing up the populations, they're actually able to get them to take into those dung pats. They reckon it's a choice thing, that by choice they will go for the stiffer pats, but when they don't have a choice, when there's big competition on it, they'll literally take it in front of them and eat it.
And have the population levels to increase that competition level. Yeah,
and the dung pat then dries out very quick then, because there's so many of them there. So yeah, they're not waiting for air drying, which will take a fortnight or even 4 weeks in Ireland. So yeah, the competition and the diversity of the beetles in large numbers creates those conditions. Yeah, so it's quite interesting.
Bruce, can I just interrupt for a second? I think Joseph's got some questions coming in, and also if anyone else on the call who's new to this wants to ask questions, there's a chat button conversation just on the bar on the thing. You can ask away. But Joseph, if you've got some questions.
Yeah, just a few have come in, just started. So given the comments regarding, I think it's grazing, do you need, continual deposits of new dung? Does that mitigate against mob grazing and long rest periods? I don't know who's that going to feel that one.
We'll go to Darren for that one.
Okay. Dung continuity is very important within the flight distance of the beetle. So if they've got somewhere to go to or come from when there's no dung available, then you'll be fine. So if you're grazing within a large scale farm and the dung beetles will move between fields and between, travel, a few kilometers. The sad thing is that there's very little research been done on the flight capabilities of a lot of these dung beetles, or that's published. So we know, for example, some of the geotrupies, the sort of big door beetles, can fly several kilometers in a night. Most of them are nocturnal. That some of the small aphrodines, sorry, I'm going blurry.
Stay still here.
Some of the small aphrodines, like Pusillus, for example, is more limited in its dispersal. So it might spend its entire life cycle within one field. So, if you want the full complement of species, then that dung continuity is actually quite important, but also to build up the populations. Because some of these, you might find a site that's very highly species rich. So you might have 10, 12 species, but you might only see a few hundred of each of those species, where what you might be seeing in a really good site is no dung, like you've seen on some of the pictures. And we do see that in parts of the New Forest, on the Mendips and a few other areas where there is that continuity and permanency and population level.
I think also it's worth noting that quite a lot of the beetles have their own specific sort of succession time within a dung pat. So some species would like a very fresh dung pat, where others would like a much older dung pat. So it's also about, sort of continuity of the depositing of that dung to enable that spread of time that the beetles can sort of find it and choose their slot, so to speak. And so under some systems of, say, mob grazing, perhaps if you're moving the cattle very frequently and from further away, that might not be so great. If, however, they're only very close by moving, moving close to, then the dung beetles can probably track that grazing system quite nicely. So again, it's sort of like the combination of those two factors, the distance.
If you go to the Mediterranean and follow around some of the herds of goats, you can watch the dung beetles following the herds of goats as well, because they want that fresh dung, pellet dung, before it dries out. And the same in parts of Africa with antelope and things.
Just probably two more questions. I think Helen's has kind of been answered. You mentioned about beetles reducing worm populations in the dung pats. Is there evidence to say that the beetles kill and destroy the parasite larvae or eggs, or is it just that they're destroying the habitat they survive in?
Both. So the dung beetles carry around with them, and some of you may have seen that one of the common names for door beetles are lousy watchmen, because they often have mites underneath. So if you see a dung beetle and you turn it upside down, you'll often see these little mites, and they're not actually parasitic on the dung beetles at all. They're phoretic, which just means they use the dung beetles as Uber. So they'll get on a dung beetle at one pile of poo, they'll be flown to the next pile of poo, they'll get off, they'll feed on whatever's around and jump back on the next dung beetle to go to the next place. And these mites are likely to attack some of the nematodes. Well, they'll basically eat they're predators. They prefer fly eggs and fly larvae, but they're predators, so they'll eat whatever's available in the dung. The dung beetles, I think Bruce mentioned it earlier, actually almost filter feeders. They suck and strain the juice, the sort of bacterial and epithelial cell soup from the dung. So they're actually
just having their tea. It'll be nice.
So they strain it out. So actually, there's only a few of the parasites that would actually go into their alimentary canal and pass through. And in some instances, people have argued that dung beetles can actually move parasites between different sites. What the evidence is and who's funded it and what's been going on there is hard to sort of like. The long-term studies are lacking, shall we say, to actually demonstrate some of this data.
Just the last question for now.
Sorry, Joseph, can I just point?
Yeah.
But in terms of part of it is the desiccation, isn't it? Is
Yeah.
it drying out rapidly means that
Yeah.
parasite
Well,
can't withstand,
yeah,
can't
so-
go through its life cycle.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of these parasites need a secondary host. They pick it up from the larvae or from the eggs, from the dung, or the larvae move away from the dung. And if you're a dung beetle and you've buried that dung, so we've got several species who do, and they bury it under the ground, we're kind of locking that dung away. Or if we're shredding it and enabling access to other beetles, the predatory beetles, which come in after the dung beetles quite often, then we're actually destroying the habitat, but also increasing the predator rate.
So yeah, just the last one, and I suppose maybe both and your experience as well, Bruce. How long does it take a species to come back if the dose and the worm stop today? So how in your experience, or from both?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question, because it also depends on the level of dung beetle populations in the local environment, and where like the recruitment that you can get from outside the wider environment from a farm. So I mean, in some instances, if you've got a rarer species, for example, once that's gone, that's potentially just gone, and you're not going to ever get that reintroduction or species to reappear. So it is quite a difficult one. I mean, I'm a horse owner, and I used to be on board years ago with the regular poo picking the paddocks and all those type practices, and quite a number of years ago, I made a conscious decision to stop that purely because of the dung beetle populations. And it took, in my instance, in my field, I would say it probably took about 6 to 7 years to actually build up to a level that I would consider to be a really good, healthy dung beetle population in that field. So it can take quite a long time. And where my field is situated, I'm actually surrounded by a reasonable amount of livestock farms. So, you know, they're sort of there in the wider environment already.
In the tropics, they think it's between 15 and 30 years if there's continuous habitat attached to that site.
Oh,
And that's in the tropics, where bigger dung beetles, they fly further and they do a lot more. And you still only get back up to 95% of the species.
But the important thing to remember is it's the ivermectin or the wormers doesn't necessarily kill them, does it?
No.
It reduces their ability to breed, and it does affect that population. But it's not like you've completely it's not like a napalm situation.
No. I mean, the sublethal effects. So basically, if the beetles aren't killed directly, there are some significant impacts, certainly of the macrocyclic lactones. And these can be sort of reduced breeding ability, reduced ability to disperse, because they kind of like lose the navigation ability or the sensory output to understand where the dung is. So you find this sort of like slow decline of the populations. So I mean, for some species, it's definitely reversible. And I think if you have more sympathetic management towards the dung beetles in terms of your application of the various veterinary products, then, you know, eventually you will recruit more dung beetles, but it does take time. And it's having that opportunity and ability to be able to afford to be able to do that time, I think, is the big issue for some farmers.
Sorry,
but Bruce, sorry.
Go on.
No, I was just saying, Bruce got an example. I'm talking anyway. Bruce has got an example. So to keep us, that it's not going to be. Do you mean it? We can start building up population sooner than that 15 years.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Bruce, when one of your neighbours sees you scratching around on your hands and knees looking at your pats, how do you kind of communicate with them, as in what benefits, how do you sell the story, and it's the story that they can easily see is a good one for them?
Yeah, well, I suppose that the immediate reaction is that they kind of think I'm down on my luck or something. But yeah, actually, my next door neighbour across the road from me has he's actually a farmer as well, and he rents out what they call hives. They're like a hut that he rents out for bird watchers. So yeah, he has quite a good healthy population of birds around here, because both him and myself don't use much wormers at all. So we've a good population of beetles in the area. Yeah. So yeah, it's a good story to be telling, to be honest. How these beetles are contributing to the environment. That's one example, I suppose. Their nutrient cycling is another. So, you know, the less nutrients potentially leaching into waterways. So yeah, I suppose that kind of gets me away with going around on my hands and knees, sifting through cow poo.
And you've also started a trend in Ireland, haven't you? You've got a project running as well.
Yeah, so we have a group of cowpat engineers. We call it Operation Defecation. So we have, I think we're on 6 nowadays.
I've lost count.
So yeah, we know what species we have in Ireland, but we don't know what species in what volumes are on what farms, if that makes sense. So, you know, there could be a guy with 2 alpacas in a field in Galway, could have one different type of beetle, whereas a guy in Cork with his 200 cows might have a different type. So he could be using Ivermectin. So it's to try and get a handle on what effects farming has on dung beetles, both species and populations. So we're collecting dung beetles and we're sending them off to the National Collection Centre, which is part of the Natural History Museum in Ireland, for identification, because I'm sure Darren and Ceri will confirm they're very hard to identify. Beetles differentiate one between the next, because you'll be looking at two different beetles that are supposedly completely different, and I can't see the difference in them. So that's why we have experts for that job. I'm an expert in my field. There, I think that's 7 nowadays.
If I knew it was a competition, I would have brought my A game. Just saying. I'm getting carried away.
Yeah, so that's the project. Yeah, and we want to see what effects basically agriculture has on beetles in Ireland. So we don't actually know if in a particular field, for example, so you take two different fields. So one has 3 cows on it that are organic, and you have your multi-species sward, old grasses in it, lowly stocked. And the next door neighbour has a field where he has the same size field where he's 100 cows on it, and he's spreading nitrogen and going in with ivermectin regularly. We don't actually know whether there's more beetles in the field with 200 cows or the field with 3 cows. So it's just to draw a kind of a synopsis on that.
I mean, there is a lack of baseline data for a lot of species in terms of their, and it's not in terms of their distribution in Ireland in particular, because there's not the sort of the large recording community that the UK mostly has. There's sort of like there's a bit missing in parts of Ireland. I mean, there are in Scotland and parts of the UK as well, you know, other parts. But one of the problems we've got with the recording is that people aren't necessarily recording the relative abundance, and it's not quantitative in any way. So it's great that we know that species X, Y, and Z occur in a field, but how many individuals? And 5 years ago, there may have been 100 individuals of each, and now there's only 3 of each. Your species richness is still the same, but your overall relative abundance is hugely dropped. And I think that's something we need to emphasize, is that it's not just about the diversity of species, it's about the relative abundance.
Recording the numbers.
Yeah, and sort of like standardizing the sort of methodologies so that you do get some comparable results, because, you know, we've got lots and lots of data spread across the last sort of 200 years, but
it's very patchy though.
Yeah, I mean, it is patchy, but it might just be that, you know, the presence of a species in, say, Lincolnshire 20 years ago might have just been a random event, and we don't know. So I think it's both getting this baseline data, having that sort of relative abundance and standardized sampling methodology, but also having the continuity of that recording effort, so you do start to see these trends and things. So if we're getting evidence through Bruce's management that there's an increase in the dung beetle populations and maybe species richness, that's documented in some way. And that's where I think the farming community can make a huge difference in this, because it's not quite a huge citizen science project, but we need to standardize the methodology and collate that data some way so that it can inform. So we've got an evidence base as opposed to just going, well, I went to this farm and I saw more beetles than that farm.
And so, well, in terms of, obviously, you've got a really active group of people who like going in investigating poo on the call this evening. So what do you mean? You've got various resources or encouraging people to go out and collect samples, and then what's the best way of getting that information to you? Or
well, I think so. We've put a couple of sort of how-to videos on a channel. I think there's a link somewhere here.
Yeah, everyone will have a link to your Facebook page.
So flotation is actually one of the, I would say, the easiest methods, apart from carrying water everywhere. But if you happen to have a river or, you know, water troughs or whatever, you can utilize that water. And the reason that's simple is because you don't have to dig in the dung and make sure you get everything out. You throw the dung in water and float everything to the top and just scoop it out with a sieve. And it's more standardized because you could actually almost weigh the dung that you put in the bucket. So you always know you're sampling 1 kilo or 1 litre of dung. Or one spadeful. So you can kind of standardize your sampling effort. So if in one field you've got 5 dung pads that you've floated, you can take an average. And you compare that to your other fields where you take 5 dung pads and you've floated. You can directly compare those in some ways, especially if the weather's been the same. So it's about that sort of getting out there, trying to get the sampling, first of all, just enjoyable. To be quite honest, but it's good for social distancing, dung beetle hunting, I've discovered.
So how long do you, I never thought we'd talk about floaters on here, but how long do you,
she's got one,
do you float? Does it?
So it's literally, you grab the dung up, you throw it in, you give it a good stir with a stick, and then you
a minute or two, and you'll have plenty of beetles hopefully floating to the surface. If you leave the beetles in there too long swimming around, they will drown. So it's good to scoop them out fairly quickly.
Well, they can hold their breath for a minute.
More like 3. They're very good. You can watch them go just as if you
hold your breath at the same time, then maybe you get an idea.
Well, no, because they've got hydrophobic hairs, so they've got hairs on their body that repel water. That's one of the reasons they can survive in dung, because they've got cutaneous fats and grease on their bodies, and they've got hydrophobic hair. So basically, when they're in the dung, the poo doesn't stick to them. I mean, everybody's had a dog that's rolled in some poo, and it's a bugger to get out the fur, isn't it? Whereas dung beetles don't want that, so they actually, they can kind of wash clean almost. So by throwing them in the dung in the water, they'll kind of float up because of the air trapped in these hairs, and then you can just scoop them out. It's a really easy method to do, and also you can use a plastic bag and grab like one bag full of poo, and then do that 5 times, and you can just take it home and do it in your kitchen sink.
Well, nice. So Bruce, do you do the floating business?
No, because we.
I'm just sorry. I was asking Bruce. Sorry.
Oh, right. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have done the floating business. Yeah, that's actually what our group. It's the method we use with our Operation Defecation group for collecting the beetles. Yeah, there's that, and I've just for the fun of it, I've set up a different type of trap then for catching them, which is it's like a basin with a piece of mesh over it. On the mesh, you put a piece of tissue paper and you bait it then with a nice fresh cow poo. So you can leave that there then for a period of time and see what flies into it.
Okay, sorry, Joseph's just messaged me. I have questions. Joseph, fire away.
I have many questions, but I'm going to stick to the ones from the participants. I'll try and group them up a little bit. There was a question, and I may come to it. So if you can say, you can delay later if you want. Can you import beetles from another farm? Well, yes?
Possibly. I mean, the problem is that there was some in New Zealand, in Australia, and in Tasmania. The species they've imported are exotic to that country and don't compete with the local fauna for resources, because most things that live in that part of the world specialise on marsupial dung. In the UK, if you're moving beetles around, you don't know what you're moving around with the beetle. So, the farm next door, that might be fine, but a farm in Scotland and you're importing to the South Downs or something, it might be slightly different, because you don't know if there's any insect-based pathogens that the population in Scotland has that are resilient to, that's not present in the southern populations. And the only way around that is to do mass rearing, which the Australians and the New Zealanders and in Tasmania, they've got it down to a fine art now. So, if somebody's got a big barn and they start mass rearing sort of Geartroopies and Aphodius and things like that, then yes, I mean, in sort of controlled environments, so we know that we're not delivering any pathogens to the local populations.
I think also,
sorry,
I was just very quickly going to mention that it's probably also quite important to ensure that the management practices are in place to support that dung beetle population once it's been introduced. Otherwise, you're sort of playing a losing game. You've got to look at all those other management options as well to encourage those populations to sort of divide and multiply. Otherwise, you're just going to be introducing something and then killing it off, essentially.
Can they survive or live in compost farmyard?
No. Well, there are a few species, but the majority need that dung soil interface to breed. So
the next ones, I'm going to start reading them as if I know what I'm talking about. Mox, I'm going to pretend I said that right. The long-acting 3 ml claims to be kinder to invertebrates than other mls. What are your views on this?
So that would be moxidectin.
Yeah,
moxidectin. Yeah.
Bruce, have you got anything to contribute?
I know that look, it's hard to know. You were talking about sublethal effects there as well. They have done trials on it in Australia and found that moxidectin was safe, but they're also still conducting trials on the effects that moxidectin has on long-term populations. They're not 100% convinced either that it doesn't have an effect on it. It certainly doesn't look like moxidectin has an effect on the offset, but I wouldn't be banking on it. I suppose it's also important to point out too that the find that the ivermectin dungs, the dungs from animals that are treated with ivermectin, are more attractive for dung beetles to their detriment, which is, yeah, it's kind of a losing battle when you start using it, really, when animals are at pasture. But yeah, moxidectin, I look at it. It's hard to know. No one's able to give you a definite answer on that, other than the companies that are selling it. So
well then, just kind of leading on a little bit from that, is the labeled withdrawal periods for wormers accurate in terms of this will affect dung beetles this many days after dosing? I don't think wormers give that kind of information.
That's to do with sort of animal health, or in terms of entering the food chain for the animal rather than the wider population.
Rather than,
And one of
the
problems we've found though is the sort of like, we don't know the longevity of the effects of the sublethal level, because most of the projects that are doing this research tend to be 2 to 3 to 4 years. It's like a PhD level. And so you might find that beyond that, you're actually seeing some negative impacts, but we're not seeing it during the study period of 3 to 4 years. So it's this steady decline in population levels. It's not just this, you don't suddenly find a result as soon as you start applying, unless you apply, directly to the dung and to the dung beetles. But you're going to find this sort of lag effect between the actual application and the consequences. And it might just be that, in another 10, 20 years, we actually find out we have no dung beetles, or we might find we actually have a lot more because they become resilient. But I'd also, point out that there are actually species level interactions with a lot of these chemicals. So one beetle that survives, it may not survive in another quantity of that same chemical. So, 0.2 to 0.5 may be the difference between survival and not surviving. And also, different species react in different ways. So it would appear as though most of our rarer dung beetles have greater sensitivity to the mectin group of chemicals, which is not surprising.
So I think we got a bit of a clarification on that last question. It was more about persistence of the product, which is sometimes stated. Do you think that's accurate in terms of the persistence of the product?
Certainly each individual chemical is going to have a different persistence time in the dung itself, and most studies seem to indicate that the sort of danger period, if you like, in terms of the amount that's excreted in the dung, is around 2 days after it's been administrated. That's sort of, that's when the level in the dung peaks, which is in the real danger point for the dung beetles. And then after that, you get a sort of a tailing off effect. And that can last a very long time, and also be, taken down into the soil as well. So it probably, in terms of persistence and sort of damaging effects to dung beetles, obviously as that peak sort of narrows off, the effects are going to narrow off for the beetles as well. But I would say most of the persistence times that are quoted are going to be less than how long they would affect dung beetles for.
And it's also worth pointing out in terms of the impact of spot on, and we'll come to what Bruce does on his farm in a second, but in terms of, it's not just wormers, is it? It's spot on. Anything that's you're putting on an animal to affect an insect is likely to have an...
Well, that was the next 3 questions all in one, Liz. So you
see, it's like I've read them.
Well, there you go. I'll just turn off my camera and leave.
No, don't do that, because last week you did that and it just didn't end well.
So how do we, I suppose the question is, how do we control worms for farmers to remain profitable and have beetles?
I think a holistic approach, and I think
Bruce's.
Bruce is probably, he's actually living the dream, so to speak. So
Yes, look at him.
yeah,
Yeah, up to my knees in it. Yeah. So I suppose it's not easy. There's no point in saying it, and I wouldn't be saying that we don't need these products at all. We do need these products in an intensive type of system, and even not intensive, just a conventional type of system. They are needed. Because I think at the end of the day, we can't expect farmers to be green when we're in the red. So, but they need to be treated like an antibiotic. So they're only used as needed. So that's the first point. So you diagnose animals and treat parasite suppression, an animal suppressed by parasites as an illness, and not worming animals as a routine job on the farm. So you need to do maybe fecal egg counts. So send off get a fresh dung from a cow that you might be suspect of, and send off the sample off to a lab. And there's plenty of labs doing it. I'm sure there's plenty in the UK as well. Even if you don't know of anywhere, your vet will point you in the right direction, and that will tell you whether they need a dose and what treatment would be best for that animal. So you try stick when animals are out of pasture. Try stick with an actual drench, so a white drench or a yellow drench, if they're needed. But the point is, the issue is with young stock. They don't have their own proper immune system to fight off these parasites. So if you keep putting in animintics, which are wormers, into these young stock as they don't need it, they'll never build up their own blueprint in order to be able to fend off these parasites. So as they get older, you will still find that you will need to go in with these wormers. So it starts with your young stock, and there's a lot of common sense stuff. This could be a little bit long-winded now, I suppose, what to do. Should I talk about it with the young stock?
Yeah, no, and I've got a picture.
Oh, Liz, we can't hear you.
That might help. I pressed the wrong button.
Oh,
Yeah, no. So in terms of cows, you haven't wormed any cows since when? We've lost Bruce now.
Ooh.
He's frozen.
Come back, Bruce. He's gone. Okay.
We'll come back to Bruce in a second.
Would you like a question from the audience while Bruce
No,
unfreezes?
it's fine. In terms of, I'm just back to Ceri for a second, because we didn't. Oh, he's back.
He's
he's back.
He's back
I'll
and
come
bigger.
back to you in a minute, Ceri. Bruce. you're
Okay,
back on.
sorry. So I go through it quickly. Young calves go out onto my farm. This is one of the outblocks that they're on. So you can see that the paddocks are different colours. We call it traffic light grazing. So calves, they're going to come up against parasites when they go out on the pasture. As they ingest them, they're going to multiply in their rumen, in their stomach, because they haven't developed yet the immunity to them. So they're going to multiply and come out the back of the calf in a higher number than it went in. So what you don't want to be doing is bringing calves back onto that same ground. So what we do is, see this paddock here is orange. So that was last grazed. Sorry, this paddock here was orange. I'm a bit short. It was last grazed with calves. So we do not put calves. We try not to put the calves back onto the orange paddocks. We go onto the green ones. The red ones are the ones where we got high fecal egg counts. So we, under no circumstances, do the calves go back onto those paddocks, because we know there's quite a large number of parasite eggs on those paddocks there. So we remove them from that. And as we go through the year, then that continually changes. So for example, this orange paddock, I will try put maybe first calving heifers onto that, or my dairy cows, if applicable, and I'll change that then back to a green paddock when I do that. So that's one of the things we do with the parasites. Then common sense stuff. We don't have a training paddock for calves. There's no specific paddock for calves when they go out with the shed, which is the traditional thing to do. You have one well-fenced paddock right beside the shed that's handy to put the calves into. That paddock absolutely dynamite. Water troughs are moved. They're never in the same place twice, because that's a real haven for parasites, where animals congregate around troughs or under trees. The calves are moved every 3 days, and they're back fenced so that they're not re-ingesting parasites, and it's actually good for grass growth as well. The heifers, then we haven't had to do it with them in terms of dosing for the last 2 years, and the cows haven't got anything since 2017. And yeah, we have a microscope on the farm there where we're continually testing for them. And the cows' readings, we're also testing antibody levels in the milk as well. And the stomach worm levels, they'll always have an antibody figure in the milk. And it kind of gives you, it doesn't give you an on-the-day reflection of what worms are in the cow's stomach, but it'll give you what exposure they've had to it. So that has stayed constant with the stomach worms, and the fluke has actually gone negative with the cows since the liver fluke has gone negative since we stopped using the wormers. So that's basically the internal parasites. So,
and sorry, Bruce, just in terms of the couple of questions, in terms of how frequently would you fecal load count those? So you were saying weekly, every 2 weeks, depends on the season.
We do it every 2 weeks, and depends on the season. If we saw a calf, that was a bit looser than others, or a bit anemic, or had a wet tail, we'll take a sample of that calf and see what's going on.
And if you did it and there was a high count, but some of them looked perfectly fine, you'd maybe leave them. Yeah,
correct. Yeah, so that's what's called refugia. So. All the cows will have parasites in their stomachs. But what we don't want to do is get rid of all the parasites out of all the calves' stomachs. That might sound a bit counterintuitive, but the reason for that is those are the parasites we want to keep, the ones that are in the calves that haven't been overcome with them. So those calves are going to be putting those parasites out into pasture, and the pasture will become flooded with those particular parasites, so that we know that those parasites will be susceptible to a drench if and when we need to use it on the next round.
And because you're also selecting your heifers, aren't you? So you're breeding, it's a closed herd, so you're breeding your own heifers, so you're also breeding some element of resilience or resistance into them as they come into your herd.
Yeah, well, we kind of, I suppose, working. We have. I know in Ireland we have what we call a cow's own work system, which records all information that you put in onto the herd management software. So, if you're putting in that an animal had a problem that had to get a parasite dose, this is all recorded. Or if she had pneumonia in the spring of last year, and this year she has liver fluke. If you're building up a profile and it comes to breeding time and you see all these problems on this one particular animal, you'll either A, not breed from her at all and just remove her from the herd, or B, use her to a breed that you're not going to be using on farm, like for a beef purpose. So they're not going to be used for breeding down the line. We're closed herd. We've been, with the exception of buying in 2 bulls, bought in 2 last year and 2 this year. And we took the napalm approach to those bulls when they come in. What we do, those bulls could have potentially in their stomach resistant parasites to antibiotics. So what we don't want is those bulls going out onto my paddocks and expelling all these parasites that are resistant to maybe a benzimidazole, which is not particularly harmful to dung beetles. So, and I want that benzimidazole to work in future. So what we do is we kept in those 2 bulls, didn't let them out onto the paddock, and gave them all 3 worm groups. So they got an ivermectin, they got a benzimidazole, and they got a levazimole, and all that was expelled into the slurry tank. Then, so now they when they join the herd, they will put in their rumens are theoretically clear, and they will put in the parasites from my own stock into their gut, so that I can be future-proofing myself, that I don't have to dose as much in future, if that makes sense.
Joseph, have we got some questions?
We've got loads of questions. Just keeping up with them. Your lungworm, what do you do for lungworm, Bruce? Are you vaccinating? That?
I'm not vaccinating. I have considered it, but the problem with vaccinating is the quarantine time with the young stock. It's probably the most frightful parasite, to be honest. But the drenches work on your levazimole and your benzimidazole will work on it. But like if you follow the procedure I was doing there, you're reducing the risk of them becoming susceptible to them. And then, you have to remember too that there's with lungworm, you're looking at 2 levels of resistance in the animal. So you have the resistance in their gut as well as their lung, and one is temporary, the other is permanent. So you need to be working on a permanent resistance build-up from the lungworm.
Then, in terms of worming cattle, I think you probably do this with your buy-in, with the bulls you bought in, is worming them when they're in the sheds.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, we call it quarantine dosing.
Winter.
Yeah. That's actually that's not something I thought of. I'm not taking the credit for that. That's what they do in Australia with sheep when they bring them into a flock. They do a quarantine drench and keep them away from the rest of their flock.
I suppose this question was more of when cattle have to go into the sheds for the winter, but I suppose it sounds like your policy that's not it's not a general rule. You worm them in at the winter time.
No, I'll only worm them if they need it. I know that's what would have been done in the past. We would have brought them in and wormed them. It was a done thing. But if they don't need to be wormed, they're not wormed.
I'll get through 1 or 2 more questions while we have the chance. So there was a lot of talk about the benefits of dung beetles. What is the extent of the damage to the pasture emanating from the fact that dung paths are all removed by the beetles? So I suppose, are they taking away some of that nutrients or some of those, or are they going to get benefit?
It has to be the opposite. The dung beetles they're putting you can treat the dung path as Graham Stevenson said in Tasmania. It's like a noxious weed when it's on top of the soil, but when it's buried into the soil, into the roots, it's food for grass, and it's food for earthworms. It's food for the soil, and you don't get those that. You don't get as exaggerated of an effect with those lush green paths or grass around paths that you would have had prior to the beetles. So yeah, they do bring plenty to the table in terms of
I imagine this is for your fecal egg counts, but it's asking what kind of microscope do you use?
It's an Olympus optical microscope. But look, I wouldn't be pushing farmers to go off and spend thousands on microscope kits or that way. The important thing is just to get in on it, get in on the idea of sending off samples and getting tested. But yeah, farmers can do it too. It's not. I think it's the vets really that should be doing it. So get on to your vet and tell them to go and buy a microscope.
There's just a bit of hearing interference. I don't know whether anybody.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we get to get to.
Yeah, I'm getting it as well. Yeah.
I don't know. Might be me. Apologies if it is. Not sure. Just I suppose, yeah, there's a lot of questions, so I'll try and ask just one more, and then we'll I'll hand it back over. So, so one question here. Joe Salatin is a great advocate of chickens following 3 days behind the grazing to eat all the flies, eggs, etc. Will this practice be detrimental to the population of dung beetles?
Chickens will eat dung beetles for sure. And I mean, there will be some impact, but I mean, chickens are quite beneficial in terms of fragmenting the dung and spreading it around, and like you say, damaging the fly populations. And I mean, they're not going to get every single bit of dung broken down to such a point that a dung beetle can't breed in it. So, you know, it will have an impact, but I don't think it's but I can't see it being that significant, because there's always going to be one piece of poo they'll miss.
That's a relief.
Chickens arrive.
I'm just wondering if we could see some beetles. Darren, could you show us your best beetle?
Oh well, that would be from abroad. If I'll share the screen if you give me a second.
Because I think we've all been out this week and collected beetles.
Right. Oh, hang on. There you go. You've got a cow first. It's my veinal. I like veinals. Right. So if we view, can you see this now?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things you have to remember that there are lots of coprophyla, so that's dung-liking beetles, as well as the dung-eating beetles, if you like. And so the main differential between the dung beetles, the true dung beetles, is the shape of the antennae, and this is the palps. This is on the head just here. You can just about see that on there. I'm just going to get slide view and make it bigger from the beginning. Is that better? Oh, yeah. Okay. Is that good for you? Oh, it's doing the weird thing on. Let's end that and put it onto a different share. It's decided that it's putting it on a different screen from you guys.
It will be worth it, people.
Is that better? Can you see it now?
Can't see anything yet.
Yeah.
Is that...
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So so basically you've got this asymmetrical club, which is usually reasonably diagnostic for the dung beetles, and most of them have it. So this is a door beetle over on the far right. And again, they've got this asymmetrical club, whereas most of the other beetles you're likely to find in dung have got a symmetrical club. So the actual club is equidistant from the antennal segments coming up to it. And they're more sort of like oblong than very circular. So here we've got, this is these are the dwellers, these are the small aphodius. Now, one thing you may notice within the dung beetle taxonomy and names is they've just changed all the names. So the latest checklist came out in 2018, and a lot of the nomenclature, the names of the dung beetles have changed. So although we're talking about aphodius, people will actually see various Melanopterus, Velinus names down. But to be honest, it's kind of irrelevant, really.
Have they got any kind of simple names like blue tit or?
There's a couple. So the door beetles, there's the common door beetle, woodland door beetle, heath door beetle, and the Dumbledore beetle. For some of some of the dwellers, so we've got one that's called Porcus, which is a beautiful beetle. In fact, I think that's on.
It's on the next slide.
It's on the next slide. Let me just get to the next slide.
I've also got some bad news. I didn't find dung beetles. I found water beetles because they had those that brown bit. I was trying to find.
Yeah, that pale bottom. Yeah. So this is some of the more typical dung beetles that you'll find. And so Rufopes is just coming out now, and this is a summer species. And you see again, they've all got this sort of asymmetrical club. And that can close or open depending on whether they're looking for the dung or not. So when they're out busy doing their dung hunting, their club's out. So here we've got Rufopes. This is a millimetre bar. So this is a widespread species, and that'll be in, I would imagine, most farms. And it's doesn't mind what soil it's on. It'll go on clay through to sand, and it does actually tunnel. Although it's part of the dweller aphodius group, it's actually a tunneler. And
it's also the beetle that's a good source of food for bats as well, this one. that roof-appease one. It sort of flies at just the right time in the evenings for the bats to come and nosh on them.
Yeah, it's one of the nocturnal species. I think we call them half moon faces or something. Yeah, half moon face. Fimatarius, this is a particularly cattle dung specialist. This likes older cattle dung. And in fact, if you break open dung that's quite old and find either little sort of chambers with a small, almost looks like a piece of rice grain egg, that's likely to be this one, Fimatarius or Eta. So it's sort of like black at the front and red at the back. But there are two species that are very similar, which, as Bruce has probably found, they're quite hard to separate. And then we have Fetidus, which has a real liking for sandy soils and is a close relation to the Fimatarius, but that has an all black pronotum. So this bit here is the pronotum, it's got all black there, and that one's got a red bit there. Fossor is possibly one of the most important for dung removal in the agri-environment, along with roof-appease. It's found from the very north to the far south on most types of soils, and it's sort of ubiquitous. And I think it's quite resilient to disturbance, rotation, and because it's quite a big, chunky beetle, it actually distributes quite easily. It sort of like disperses nicely. These are the ones that everybody will have seen. These are the ones that fly around in the early spring and autumn. And annoyingly, there's 2 or 3 species that are quite hard to separate. And we've called these the decimators, I think, mostly because they completely decimate the dung when there's lots of them. And the problem is that to identify them to species, you need to be able to see the base of the pronotum, which is this bit, and edges of the wing cases, which is this bit here, to be 100% sure of the 2 different species. But since they're both very, very widespread, it probably doesn't really matter that much if you don't know which one you have. And then we've got these are the tunnelers. So we've got the Similis and Cenobita, the 2 sort of like shiny tunnelers on sand and probably on calcareous grasslands as well in particular. This one will go into heavy clays as well. And then Spinager, which is one of the door beetles.
And that was the blue bomber that Bruce was mentioning earlier.
But some of the more interesting species that you might get, Medarius, which is in the top left, is a little tiny sort of orangey yellow species, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's like a bright orange, and that's significantly declined in the UK. And when I first started, I used to find it in every bit of horse poo, and now if we see it 2 or 3 times a year, we're quite happy. And one of the local farms here has it on it, which is really nice. Nemoralis is the northern one, and this is one that requires dung in woodland. So you'd mostly find it on sheep in woodland or deer. Porcus is the mahogany ridgeback, we've called that one, because it's sort of like this reddish colour and quite defined stripes down it. This is a winter active species, and again, this has significantly declined in the UK, and we most often see it in cattle and horse dung on sort of unimproved to semi-improved pasture. And Sordida is one that's disappeared from probably 90% of its sites, and likely because of sensitivity to chemicals. And now the only place I've ever seen it in abundance is in the Norfolk sandy Brecklands and on the Outer Hebrides. And then this is a sad loss for us, because this one went extinct post-war, and it's likely because this is so sensitive to chemicals that it just couldn't cope with probably even residual DDT in the environment, and the dig for Britain using a lot of the chemicals. So that's not been seen for 60, 70 years in Britain. So coming up with common names, we're trying, but some of them I've been told up. So there's one called Hemorrhoidalis, and I want to call it the red-arsed beetle, but apparently that's not allowed.
Not a thing.
It's not a thing.
Can I just interrupt you quickly, because I think Joseph has some questions and he's worrying about the time. So
Yeah.
Can I just?
And we need to also show some things from Tasmania as well before we go.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
I know. Yeah.
Oh, we get to see beetles from Tasmania.
Yeah.
It's just a
Joseph.
note to myself: be very careful what I text Nicola. Anyways, worrying. Anyway, I'll do this. Can you give any estimate for typical Irish and UK farms if you stopped using Mecton wormers? what would be the increase in dung beetle population?
Yeah, that's a hard
quite
one.
tricky. Yeah, quite tricky. I think it can be very individual. So depending on the species and the local environment,
soils,
and the other management practices, it would certainly be a good start to reduce sort of those chemical wormer impacts on the environment, and as Darren said, soils. I mean, I think the key thing here is there is a difference between having quite a poor population and a good population, and that's a scale, you know, so each, as time goes by, that will get better and better. But it's quite tricky. I mean, you are talking probably anywhere between 3 to 10 years, I would think. Would you agree with that, Bruce?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what you'd be looking at, yeah, to be honest. Yeah.
I'll do a round of quick fire. Sorry.
Okay, go on then.
I'll do a round and hopefully they won't. Are there any dung beetle maps like the UK bird book to show where they live?
There's the NBN Atlas, which has got all of the recording schemes data. Which if you Google NBN Atlas, and then if you know the species you're looking for, you can look up a particular species, but you can also look at dung beetles in general from that. I mean, if you want, I can sort of like put together some resources so people can find those sorts of maps. And eventually there will be a national atlas, but that's a few years off because we're still collecting data from museum collections to give us the historical context.
I think information like that would be good because there's some more questions about how many different habitats are there in the UK for dung beetles. I don't know if that's something you could include.
Anywhere there's dung.
Anywhere there's dung, pretty much.
So that can be anything from your on farm through to deer in the local woodland, all the way through to even dog dung or dog poo on sand dunes.
We've got 3 or 4 species of dung beetle in our garden on Pippi's poo.
That's our dog.
That's our dog.
I'll just qualify that.
But we do have, farm fields around us with livestock as well. So
just and then the last one for now. There was a website about dung beetles, Dung Beetle UK Mapping Project. They said it was shut down last week, and they're just wondering, is it coming back?
Possibly, yeah. We've had a few technical glitches with it, so yeah, bear with us on that one.
Cool. I think that's enough for now. I'll hand you back.
Thanks, Joseph.
I've hopefully shared.
Liz, you're quite quiet.
Yeah.
Have you shared? Can you see my screen? Can you see some other pictures have come up?
Yes.
So this is sort of linked to that, which is we've talked a bit about how to increase it, and naturally it would take 5, 10, 15 years to naturally increase populations. But Bruce, in your Nuffield trip, you went to Tasmania, or saw this example from Tasmania, where they've really ramped up populations, haven't they, by that captive breeding program that was mentioned earlier. So I don't know whether you just want to talk through that.
Yeah, so Tasmania was particularly interesting because it would have a very similar climate and conditions to Ireland and the UK. So these pictures are from the labs in Canberra in South Australia, where they bring in the dung beetles from
France and Spain. I'm filling in the gaps.
Oh, he's gone again.
Just while we're waiting for Bruce to come back, there's a question that's come through, which is what, in terms of the number in a pat. So we would go measuring worms, for example, in soil, and we would say between 10 and 15 in a spadeful is a really good number.
Yeah.
Is there a rough guide of, if we go and do a flotation, if we found one like mine, I'd be disappointed.
Yeah. So we did on the flotation we did, which you'll see on the video. We had 7 different species of true dung beetle, as well as the rove beetles and the water beetles. And I think in total there was about 60 beetles. So and that's but it is sort of old pasture there. But the animals are treated, but it's permanent pasture, and we've got sheep and cattle in the local area, so there's quite a variety of livestock near us. So that would be considered good.
So 60 is good.
Yeah.
What's medium could do better?
20 to 30 individuals, and then with terms of species, it's anything from 5 to 15 on any particular site. And again, some of this is seasonal, so you'll get a lot of seasonal variation, and you'll have to do the finger test for the actual dung itself if you've got cattle, because if it's too fresh, it's too soon for the dung beetles to have got to it. If it's too old, you're limiting the number of species that like quite old dung. So it's like the Goldilocks principle, it's not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. So once you've got your eye in for those perfect pieces of poo, and you just basically stick your finger in, and if there's if there's too much resistance and you can't actually get your finger into the dung, it's probably too old. If you can just go straight through and there's only a thin skin, it's too fresh. And so you want that bit of resistance, because that's shown that the dung's been around for at least 24 hours and that there's drying happening. And then that's usually where you'll find your 24 to 48 hour highest diversity. So you aim for that sort of dung pile. And as long as you're doing that and not getting the really old stuff, you'll always be disappointed if you do old dung, because there's fewer species and fewer abundant. So you've got to kind of judge the age of the dung as well as the quantity that you're going to float from to see how many you're getting.
So practice and go in and stick your finger in dung.
Yeah, basically just go and poke some poo, to be quite honest.
Hello, welcome back, Bruce. Sorry, Darren.
That's
Bruce.
Sorry.
So
I
you
think
went to Tasmania. This has been set up 3 times now. Let's
go.
I'm
sorry. I think my computer senses puns coming. Yeah. So in Australia, there were attacks with a problem that they had to tackle, because Australia and Tasmania are new countries in that they had no cattle in it prior to the mid 1800s. So when they introduced these animals, they didn't bring the dung beetles with them. Now the dung beetles that they have in Australia, the native ones, and Tasmania are for, as Darren was saying there, they're native dung beetles for the marsupials, which are your kangaroos and your koala bears, and they didn't like the dung from the cattle. So they got this problem that the paddocks were being succumbed with with dung pats. So in the 60s, they come up with this plan to introduce dung beetles they were actually from South Africa at the time, and have since moved on to our European ones.
Bruce, can I just interrupt, Bruce? Can you just talk about the problems they found and the flies and all that bit of the story?
So the big story was flies, and it was particularly in urban situations, where the bush fly was coming out of the bush and prolificating in the dung pats. So they were coming out in their swarms into the towns and the cities. In Canberra, they couldn't, if they had a lunch with them, they couldn't eat it outside, because if they took a sandwich out of a lunchbox, by the time they get it into their mouth, they'd be eating flies. That was back in the 60s. And now today they have restaurants out in the streets, and they're able to eat al fresco and have barbecues without any issues at all, thanks to these beetles that they introduced. So what they do here, you can see in the picture, the girl on the left, her job in the lab is she feeds the dung beetles. That's her title. And on the right here, these are spaghetti tubes, which they actually breed the dung beetles in. So what they do is the beetles they bring in, they get those beetles to lay eggs, and they basically sterilize the eggs and grow the beetles, a colony of beetles from those eggs, and sell those colonies then to private companies who breed them on further to sell to farmers. And farmers are paying money now for these beetles for various reasons. So that's where they're at now with it. Tasmania, as was alluded to earlier, was these are breeding tents you can see here in the picture. Tasmania was particularly impressive because you could walk into a paddock that had been grazed 3 days prior to it, and there's no sign of any dung paths, which is absolutely phenomenal to see it. Because we're looking at a couple of weeks here really before that we get that effect at best. And because of that, then they're not needing the same issues with meeting the same issues with parasites that we're hitting in this country. Yeah, that's basically it. And again, there were, as I was saying, there were intensive farms. These are cages where they actually rear them out in the fields. The picture on the left there is where they're out in fields, and basically when they feed them there a couple of times in the week, and when they're happy enough that they've laid enough eggs, they leave the tops off of those cages, and the beetles emerge then on the farm. That's the process to do. And you can see the picture on the right then, the little holes in a dung pat here where there's beetles actually getting into it. That's a dung pat. That's a quite sloppy one.
Yeah.
That they're actually taken into it quite quickly. That you actually, if you look closely at it, you can actually see a beetle on it. Yeah, so it's amazing to see what can actually be done even in an intensive system. They really got government funding behind letting these beetles out, and they got public media, and they were in schools, and got everyone behind getting these beetles out into the countryside. So yeah, that's a real success story there.
And you've started trying to breed, or sort of increasing your population by captive breeding.
Yeah, I'm trying a bit of meddling with it. So I started at it. I'm going to probably try a bit more at it now as well. Putting them into a cage and rearing them in it, just to see, because they found that when they released dung beetles in high concentrations in mixed species, that it was the best way to do it, because when the beetles were in high concentrations and mixed species, the competition for the dung was far greater, and the chances of them finding a mate was far higher, and they found that they had a higher rate of offspring in beetles when did it that way, as opposed to letting them out with plenty. You would think letting them out with plenty of dung would be the way to do it. Which, I kind of suppose it's kind of artificially creating a race for dung within the beetles. So that's the way they done it, and it seemed to work anyway. So I'd like to try it here and see, kind of replicate it on my own farm.
Thank you.
We have got quite a few questions. I'm just wondering whether, if we don't get through all the questions, Darren, whether you could answer some of them via Facebook on your chat, yeah. Possibly. Is that, yeah. If we don't get through them all? I don't want to.
If you've put all of the questions onto the Facebook page, I think there's a link somewhere in the resources to do with this. Yeah. Then and you can post pictures of beetles you want identifying if you so wish. And then we can answer them to the best of our ability. And somebody's asking about sheep and stuff, and it's the same with sheep as cows, but sheep dung's sometimes better than cow dung.
Drier.
Yeah, exactly.
But they don't like the pellets.
That might help.
The pellets.
Liz, I don't know if I just wanted to say one more thing, Liz. What's your thoughts, Liz? Have you got any other paths you want to go down?
No, I think I'm intrigued. I'm still intrigued by them. I still am now even more gutted I haven't found any. I found water beetles, but
sure you
tomorrow's another day.
They'll be there. They'll be there.
Yesterday or over the weekend, I had a conversation with Darren and Ceri, and I think it was just quite, with carbon calling in the background. Carbon calling is all about soil and from the ground up. And Darren, you talked about, just tell us your thoughts on top heavy. Was that the word? Top heavy top-down conservation.
Top-down conservation. So, you know, we spend a lot of time trying to conserve the sort of the big and the fluffy and the pretty birds and the mammals and things without taking into consideration some of the invertebrates that are actually the ecosystem engineers, the actual things generating they're sort of like the soil. So a lot of the soil biota, the sort of macro flora and fauna that's in the soil is very, very important. But you don't kind of see David Attenborough going, we must save the mites that are in the soil, or we've got to save the fungus. And in fact, I think in the agri-environment, the soil health is probably one of the key things. And, you know, looking after the plants and the invertebrates and the soil fauna and flora, you know, it's basically, if we look after that, a lot of the things that everybody else is trying to save will look after themselves. You know, if you've got a good habitat for invertebrates on your land, because you're sympathetic towards that sort of management, you're going to get recruitment of all sorts of things coming. Insects are slightly more difficult to get because they don't fly as far as a bird. I mean, some of these birds, you know, come from Africa to spend their time with us. You won't find many insects doing that can actually survive. So, you know, we've got to look after the sort of like the bottom layer. I think for those people who look after land, the bottom layer is the kind of the crucial element. And it's all been well. They're good flagships, these big things. So, you know, having otters is great, unless you've got trout, I suppose. But, you know, if you want to look after soil health and productivity, you know, these invertebrates and worms keeps cropping up in the conversation. You know, earthworms, sorry. You know, I mean, there are obviously some negative ones like the parasites, but, you know, I think that looking after the bottom instead of this top heavy conservation is actually crucial.
Bruce, have you got anything to add on that? Oh, you're on mute.
There, how's that?
Better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We like, from a farmer's point of view, I didn't even know I had dung beetles until recently. So it just shows that we don't appreciate them enough. But like you just as I was talking about one of those cages, I had coal tits trying to attack one of them to get in with beetles. So it just shows like that, you know, we can put up these hedgerows and these bird boxes and expecting them to eat fruit that's going to come maybe later on in the year, but you know, really, like Darren was saying, it starts with the from the ground up. So you know, you need to have the soil right to have, and your cows eating the right grass to have your dung beetles in the first place. The dung beetles are the feed for the birds, for small birds, and your small birds are feed for your big birds, and like it comes from the ground up. That is for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's past 9 o'clock. Oh, Liz?
Yeah. No, I've just got one thing, which is a plea from Neris, who is said many times, which is her big concern in this is that people will also go out and never use a clear wormer ever again because of the concerns about dung beetles. So part of her plea is to make sure that you have an understanding of the efficacy of your wormers on your farm. That's the first start.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, we should have said that from the onset. We're not anti-worming. We're, you know, it's more about, I mean, as Bruce has sort of emphasised, it's about targeted worming, which might make it more cost effective in the long run, but also we might even avoid the sort of resistance that we're seeing in some of the chemicals used in farming industry at the moment.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. They are a miracle drug, really. Yeah. But you really have to treat them like an antibiotic and use them only as needed. And it is showing up with issues already in Ireland and the UK that these parasites are becoming resistant to these drugs. So if we continue using them the way we are, there's only 3 drugs that we can use in cattle, 5 in sheep. If we continue using them the way we are, we're going to run out of these drug groups. So they're not going to do their job. So it's important that we look after the drugs as well as looking after your dung beetles. But yeah, it's just, we don't want to be using them as a management tool. They're there. They're a medicine.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I just, in terms of, was just going to promote, do you mean in terms of the podcast that we're doing on that via Buzzsprout, and also that we can, this will be on our YouTube channel shortly. That was my only few things.
Oh, is that a YouTube? Oh.
So, well, thank you both, well, all very much, Bruce, Darren, Ceri. It's been, we all know a lot about dung beetles now, but we all need to go out and find some tomorrow.
Yeah.
Everybody on the call, on your hands and knees, looking for dung beetles.
Yeah.
But thank you. Yes, just thank you very much.
Welcome.
And I'm very keen to promote your Facebook page. So, yeah, anyone online who wants to have a look at that, the link's been sent, but I'll send it again.
Yeah, thank you.
And then, Liz, I think we're going international.
We are. But we're also, because it's now getting a busier time of year, we're going to try and lockdown is slightly weakening. We're going to go monthly, and hopefully the next one will be a bit more of a sort of refocus on mob grazing. So we'll try and so that will be end of June. So yeah, we'll be back in contact. We've got your details, so we'll be back in contact with the date for that.
We're after a theme tune.
Are we?
Joseph is worried that we haven't got a twinkle twinkle at the beginning.
I think that's the least of our worries. I'm amazed.
I'm gonna have to help you with your phrasing. I said you needed some elevator music at the start while people are waiting.
All right.
Rather than I was worried. I'll practice the banjo for the next few weeks.
Yeah,
We'll see what we knock out. Yeah.
He's online. Well, and thank you to Joseph.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you
Thank
all
you very
again.
much.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Like, I love this.